We're speaking today with Dr. Harry Bush, former Group Director of Economic Regulation at the UK Civil Aviation Authority, after the publication of a new independent study on airport competition by Copenhagen Economics. Dr. Bush acted as steering director on the study.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Dr. Bush, this study talks about airports operating in a new environment. What exactly is meant by that?
Well, I think there are a number of things coming together over the last 10 or 20 years. I mean, first of all, you had the liberalisation of aviation in the 1990s, and that led to the growth of new airline models, in particular the low-cost model, and over time, through that, to the growth of large pan-European airlines. I mentioned particularly Ryanair and EasyJet, but others too. And these airlines are able to operate between any 2 points in Europe. And what this means is that when they're thinking about where they fly from, they are comparing airports across Europe, not just in relation to local catchment areas. And that has enormously increased the competition between airports. You've also seen the empowerment of consumers through the internet at the same time. So consumers are now able, passengers are now able to compare prices and quality of service and destinations at a flick of a switch. And something like 50% of tickets are booked on the internet, so this applies to a large number of journeys. So that's the second development. And the third development you've seen in this period is the commercialisation of airports, partly in response to the way in which aviation has been growing, but more generally as the state has loosened its grip on the airport sector, so that airports have either been privatised or they have been operated more at arm's length from government. And that has changed the dynamic, enabling them more clearly to respond to the pressures from airlines and passengers, but also focusing more on their bottom line. I mean, something like half of European passengers leave from airports which are run privately or have private shareholders.
And what are the day-to-day implications of these market developments?
Yes, so what this means is that because the low-cost point-to-point airlines are able to compare between airports throughout Europe, they have shown an ability to switch between airports at relatively short notice. There's a good deal of churn in routes, so something like 15 to 20% of routes churn every year. That means that those routes are up for grabs. That airline capacity is up for grabs, so airports have got to compete for that on a pretty much a continuing basis. The second point, I think, is that if you look at the hub airlines, the legacy airlines as some call them, they have less capacity, less ability to switch between airports because they're much more committed to serving their local catchment area plus the transfer traffic that comes through. However, even there, developments are changing things because what you've got is the growth of what you might call multi-hub airlines. So a number of airlines now operate, particularly with the consolidation, for instance, Air France and KLM, British Airways and Iberia, now operate from a number of hubs. And at the margin, that gives them choices about where they increase their capacity, reduce their capacity. So they are no longer, although they are committed to their existing hub airports, they have choices about where they can grow their business, and that again gives them some pressure, some leverage over the airports. And the result is that the airports face airlines with significant buying power in many cases, where they can, because they have this ability to switch, to make decisions at the margin, that they can, and they are significant presences at those airports, they have leverage over that airport. They can negotiate on price and on quality of service. I mean, something like 8 out of 10 airports, at 8 out of 10 airports, the largest carrier accounts for over 40% of the traffic, and that is a significant position of bargaining power.
You've spoken a lot about how airports have to respond to the needs of airlines, but how does the passenger fit into all of this?
Well, passengers also have much more choice than they used to. And if we look, we've done in the study, there were a number of pieces of analysis done to show just the extent of that choice. So first of all, you have geographical catchment areas. So something like 2/3 of European passengers are within 2 hours drive of 2 airports or more. So that gives them some choice. But We looked also at how that choice plays out in practice, looking at whether the routes available at different airports really gave effective choice to passengers. So it wasn't just a question of the airport being there, but did the airport actually offer routes that competed with routes at another airport? And we found there was a significant degree of choice there, and that something like 50% of passengers on intra-European routes actually do have an effective choice within reasonable driving time of routes at different airports. So again, passengers there have the ability to switch. There's also much greater choice in transfer options. So something, again, like 2/3 of passengers have effective choice of transfer options between one or more hubs. So again, choice for passengers is obviously pretty critical and has been growing over time. And I think the interesting phenomenon as well has been that over time the proportion of leisure passengers relative to business passengers has been growing. I mean, leisure passengers have been the growth area of aviation in Europe over the last 10 or 20 years. And these passengers, assisted by the internet, are much more price sensitive than business passengers. So adding to the pressure, the competitive pressure on airports and airlines as well, but on airports as well as airlines.
So what do all these pressures mean in practice for airports?
Well, what it means, I think, is that they're facing multiple competitive pressures. So pressures from a number of sources. So the old idea that airports are monopolies, I think, really has to be questioned, and questioned quite severely. Most airports now are facing some competitive pressure. It may well be from airlines being able to switch. It may be from passengers being able to switch, maybe for transfer passengers being able to switch between airports. And many of those airports will be facing pressures from all of those sources. And I think you have to look at the competitive pressures on airports in relation to the nature of their business. These are fixed-cost businesses, generally, with large capital-intensive facilities. Many of their operating costs are also fixed. You need to maintain your fire service, a lot of your security apparatus, almost regardless of how many passengers are going through. And that creates a need to drive passenger traffic in order to cover those costs. That is also accentuated by the fact they've got two sources of revenue: aeronautical revenues, the revenues they get from the airlines and passengers directly, and also retail revenues. And so that combination of a fixed cost base and a two-sided revenue base means that there's a considerable pressure on them to increase passengers and therefore to compete with other airports. So what you've got there, pressures and a degree of response from airports driven by their new commercial focus as they've been privatised and put at arm's length from government.
And can you give some examples, some visible signs of how airports are responding to these pressures?
Yes, so competition you can describe, but it only really can be seen to work if it's actually leading to better outcomes for consumers, for passengers and for airlines. So what actually are you seeing in that way? So the report looks at a number of issues here. I mean, first of all, we look at service quality. And the interesting thing there is you can see through the ACI's own airport service quality metrics and through transfer waiting times increases in service quality outcomes for passengers. So if you take transfer waiting times, there's been over the last 10 years or so a reduction on average across Europe of 10 minutes. And that is the result of the work that airports, along with their airlines, have put into trying to make their transfer products more competitive with other airports. You're seeing a lot more marketing by airports, marketing to airlines, marketing to passengers in some instances. So that is evidence that they really need to compete. The growth of the routes conferences, where airports market their wares to airlines, shows that there is a market out there. So a good demonstration, if you like, of the extent to which this market is out there and is operating. And we've also seen airports responding in their infrastructure developments to the new business model. So many airports have had to build special facilities for low-cost operators, because these low-cost operators do not want all of the facilities that a hub-operated airport usually has. And in doing so, they have to show a degree of flexibility around investment, around operating, which again demonstrates the competitive pressures they're under. And that has actually increased, if you like, the competition within the market, because it's brought on this extra capacity which is available to the low-cost carriers. There's also been an increase, actually, in the number of airports anywhere in Europe. I mean, something like 81 more airports in 2008 than in 1996, as the low-cost phenomenon has made the entry of new airports, these are often ex-military bases, the entry of new airports easier, because the degree of investment you have to undertake to run those basic services is so much less. So across a number of metrics there, you can see the impact of competition. Also like to draw attention to the fact that in the recession, when you saw a reduction of passenger traffic, airports generally sought to modify their pricing in order to respond to that. So across Europe, you saw either prices being held relatively steady or actually coming down. Again, some evidence there that airports are having to respond to the market pressures, passengers and airlines that they face.
And finally, in this new world of airport competition, what are the implications for transport policy in Europe?
Well, I think there are a couple of points here. First of all, just at the level of transport planning, there's a good deal of evidence that airport competition is increased by the way in which the high-speed train network operates. So that train network can often increase the catchment areas that airports have, and therefore increase the overlaps between airports. And in doing so, it increases airport competition and the outcomes for consumers, as well as providing the more basic transport that is obviously its prime objective. So I think we should pay some attention to that, if you like, second round effect of the development of the high-speed rail network. Second point I think is quite important is to look at the way in which regulation of airports is conducted. As I said earlier, the old assumption was that airports were monopolies and needed regulation. That no longer holds. The evidence in this study shows that airports are subject to competition. And it's important to recognise here a fundamental fact that not all passengers and not all airlines have to have choice in order for competition to be effective. The important thing is that there is competition at the margin, and if there is sufficient competition at the margin to affect the airport's bottom line, so to speak, that will protect passengers generally. So monopoly usually means that the passengers are bound in. Competition means that they have choice. But not all passengers, not all airlines have to have choice for there to be effective competition. I think that needs to be recognised in designing a regulatory system. But the real issue then against that background is that it's for the proponents of regulation to say where regulation needs to be required. The assumption that it's required everywhere should be dismissed. There needs to be a case made based on proper assessments of how much competition there is, how much market power remains, and then importantly, what sort of regulation is proportionate to whatever market power there is. One of the findings of the report is that most airports do have some degree of competition. So even where there may be some market power, there are competitive forces, and that needs to be taken into account when designing regulations. So one of the recommendations of the report is that the form of regulation should be much more focused on enabling negotiations between the parties to take place, with the regulator standing back a little, maybe acting in a backstop role wherever necessary, and that may be at relatively few airports overall. It's interesting in this regard to look at the Australian system, where they have airports, because of geographical distance, which have much more potential market power than in Europe, but where they have, because of the costs of regulation, sought to stand back and review the operation of their light-handed approach every 5 years or so, but broadly let the airlines and airports get on with it. And there may be something to learn from that model, which has now operated for some 10 years relatively successfully.
Dr. Bush, thank you very much for your time today.